Thank you, McConan, and thanks to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung for inviting me here. I love coming to these presentations. One always gets promotions from when people introduce you. I was actually a student at those 3 universities. Now I've become a professor. Okay. The OECD, I presume, was invited here to bring some numbers to the discussion. And that's what I'm going to be doing here today. I think you'll have a bit of an overdose by the time I'm finished. So let's get right into it. Here's roughly what I'll be talking about. This outline gives you at least perhaps the appearance of the structure to my presentation. I hope there's be some reality to it as well. Let's get right into it now. First set of numbers. This is essentially a basic result in what we call employment rates. That is the proportion of people employed in the 15 to 64 age group. Here we essentially take the employment rate of the foreign-born and the native-born, and we subtract. And if the immigrants are on the left side of the zero line, it's because their employment rates are lower. Okay? So you see for men there, actually you have more than half of the countries here have employment rates for men that are higher for the foreign-born. And if you look at what countries you have there, it's basically Southern Europe, Ireland, and a lot of the Central and Eastern European countries. The old migration countries all have, so-called old migration countries all have, are on the negative side. For women, of course, you have far fewer countries that are on the positive side. Now we can get into some of the reasons for that if you want. The thing to retain is that the new migration countries here are the ones that seem to be doing well, plus the United States for men. Okay? So the reason now, the thing is, what's the connection? The question we can naturally raise is, what's the connection between integration policy and this sort of basic result on integration, employment rates? So I did a very simple-minded thing here. I looked at the 2007 MIPEC score at the bottom, and I put the employment rate difference on the vertical axis. Now you could be forgiven for concluding that the link is not very obvious. I did this for each of the components, and the result was largely the same. If anything, the connection seems to be a little negative. So why is this? Why? I mean, it's a bit of a mystery here. Why do we have a negative or a no obvious link between rated integration policies and actual outcomes? Now, I've put together here a number of the possible reasons. And incidentally, the OECD has done about 10, 12 reviews of integration in the labor market, policies in this area over the last 4 years. And in every country you see, quite frankly, policies which are impressive. There are always gaps, of course, and you often wonder why the differences persist with all of the efforts going into this. There's goodwill in every country, lots of initiatives occurring. Well, here are some of the reasons, possibly. Well, having a policy is one thing. Having an effective policy may be another. Okay? And integration policies are perhaps not as effective as we would like them to be. Or the second reason, perhaps we're just not reaching out far enough. Okay? The policies are there, but they're not reaching enough for immigrants. Or, if you want, the catastrophe scenario is the third one here. The policies are as effective as they could be, and luckily we have them, or things would be even worse without them. Or a fourth reason, we're not comparing really like with like when we compare that first chart that I show you. Immigrants and native-born persons are different in certain respects, and I'll show you some of the ways in which they're different. And this would result in differences even under perfect conditions. Other things, of course, perhaps the integration policies are not really addressing some of the issues. And finally, well, maybe some of the results really don't depend on integration policies, but on other things. Again, this sounds a little cryptic, but I'll be getting into some of the reasons for it. I'll be spending most of my time here on perhaps the last 3 points here. Okay? So let's get right into the first of these. Now, I mentioned that integration, immigrants and non-immigrants are different. One of the ways in which they are different, of course, is in their educational attainment. Europe, a lot of the migration historically has been of less educated migrants, okay? Of migrants that are less educated than the native-born. Different age distribution as well. Now, but we can statistically adjust for this and see what the results would be if migrants had characteristics that were more similar to those of the native born. That's purely a matter of adjusting for structural differences. And you can the white one bar there corresponds to what's observed. The green corresponds to what happens when you adjust for education and age. And you can see, for instance, Germany is the fifth one up. Practically 2/3 of the difference in the employment rates of immigrants and non-immigrants in Germany seem to be attributable, I suspect here this is largely educational attainment. Differences in educational attainment. A lot of the immigrants to Germany have been lesser educated, and for all OECD countries, people that are well educated have better labor market outcomes than people who are lesser educated, both native born and foreign born. So this is perhaps one of the reasons for the differences. Okay. Second reason, the composition of migration. When I say this, of course, we know that policies are very different about what migrants are admitted into a country. Some countries have lots of labor migrants, others are more open to humanitarian migration. All countries have a fair amount of family migration. And these things matter because, well, it's fairly obvious that labor migrants have the best outcomes. When they arrive, quite often in Europe, they already have a job. Okay? And when you look at the empirical data, what you see is that humanitarian migrants have the poorest outcomes. And there are reasons for that. They're the one group, if you want, that's really not made an economic trade-off. They've quite often fled persecution. They've perhaps had some of them have been tortured. Adjustment is not necessarily easy. Now, what I've done here is I looked at Australian employment outcomes just a little bit after arrival. That's all. I would have preferred to have gone about 5 or 10 years down the line, but this is all the data I could get. And I did a little simulation here. I said, well, suppose Australia had Sweden's composition of migration, which tends to be much more humanitarian until recently, until they've put in their new migration policy, which is much more oriented towards labor migration now. Well, this is the situation you'd have. Australia would have sort of a 33% rather than 51% employment rate early upon arrival. And that tends to persist over time. Same thing, similar result. Much higher unemployment rates than with its current composition of migration. Australia, incidentally, does have what it boasts that it has 60% labor migration. That's not quite true. They're actually, it's 25% is closer to the point, to the mark. But, of course, they're very highly selected, very educated people. Their spouses are also highly educated. And they don't have to have a job upon arrival. Very different from European-type migration. But anyway, that's the story with respect to how the composition of migration can, in fact, have a significant impact on your actual results. So the more labor migration you have, the better your outcomes are naturally going to be. And this shows up, in fact, when you compare across countries to a certain extent. This, incidentally, is one of the reasons, I think, why the southern European countries have done so well. Those results I showed you, incidentally, were before the crisis. Lots of migration to those countries in recent years has been labor migration. This is a big labor migration area in Europe in recent years. Third point that you might want to consider, when you do introduce a policy, it has to be based on a proper diagnosis of the situation. Okay. And here's one of the areas where international comparisons can tell you a lot. And here one of my colleagues prepared this. This is a terribly informative chart here. What he's done is basically the same sort of thing. You sort of take employment rates of foreign-born, subtract the native-born, and you do it for different educational levels, the low-educated and the highly educated. And curiously enough, what you see is for the low-educated, when you compare like with like, they're actually doing quite well in many European countries. You see, they have higher employment rates than the low-educated native-born, except for those at the bottom there. But the highly educated, practically everywhere, okay, first of all, do not have employment rates that are quite as good. In fact, they're not doing as well compared to the low-educated. Of course, they're doing better in the labor market. High-educated person is going to have a higher employment rate than the low-educated. But if you compare like with like, they're not doing as well as the low-educated immigrants. Okay? So this is an interesting diagnosis. And the thing is, when you see something that's this systematic across, 20 countries with one exception, United Kingdom, you're on to something here. Okay? So we're going to look a little more closely at this. I want to give you some specific examples. I told you you'd be hit with a lot of data here, so here's one. And I'm going to take you outside of Europe now to the country that everyone looks upon to a certain extent as a model. And because essentially Canada is having certain problems these days. Okay? If you look at the actual what's going on in Canada in the last 15, 20 years, now we're seeing results that you've never seen before in Canada. Okay? Unemployment rate of the highly educated, and migration to Canada is very highly educated. Okay? Twice that, for those who arrived in the last 5 years, twice that of the native born for this prime age group, 25 to 39. Look at the results on medium wages. You never saw this in the past, in the 1970s. Okay, what's changed? Well, the composition of migration by country of origin has changed. Now, I want to get into that a bit more. So this is a sort of I wanted to take you out of Europe just to show you a country where it is selecting for highly educated migrants and is having some problems. So why is this? Okay. Now, here's a study that's been terribly illuminating by a Canadian researcher, Aureopolis. These testing studies have been done in quite a lot of countries these days. These are studies in which fictitious applications are sent by the researchers to real job offers. Okay? Enterprises have job offers on the internet, wherever, newspapers. So they concoct fictitious applications which differ in ways that are randomly, but in ways that are controlled. In this particular, the applications were adjusted for name. They had English names on the one hand versus Chinese, Indian, what's the third? Pakistani names. Then they were controlled for where the experience was obtained and where the education was obtained. Okay? And essentially, you wait, see what happens, and you get callbacks for interviews. Okay? You compare the differences in the callbacks. And you have, in the European countries, you get a much, much more difference than that. But anyway, I'm not here to sing the praises of Canada, but just to give you some examples. Now, one of the interesting things, the very interesting things, is that the foreign candidates with a sort of a foreign-sounding name, well, you can't even say that in Canada anymore. There's so many Chinese and Indian immigrants in Canada. But anyway, after 4 to 6 years of Canadian work experience, where your diploma comes from doesn't matter anymore. Employers don't care. Okay? Very interesting result. Okay? If you want to it's not something that's going to be illuminating for policy. Here's something. And finally, the third thing, the full, what we call native profile candidates. That candidates have a English-sounding name, Canadian education, Canadian experience. They have 3 times more callbacks than foreign profile candidates that have foreign name, foreign education, foreign work experience. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot. Okay, so this is a very illuminating study. I've got the results here. It's going to be on the. I'm leaving the PowerPoint, so you can, if you want the actual results, you can consult the original study even better. This is what they are, but I'm not going to bear on this. So, what are the lessons from this? One of the interesting lessons from this study is that 60% of the difference in callbacks, and hopefully this is reflected in actual results in the employment in the labor market, can be overcome just by the acquisition of domestic work experience. Okay? If you want to put your efforts somewhere, get the immigrants into the labor market. You know, what it didn't do, unfortunately, this study, it didn't say what kind of job you should get them into. That would be nice to see. I mean, does any job matter? Does it have to be a job that's commensurate with your qualifications? It didn't go that far. Okay. Now, the name-based discrimination, what I've called here, is a bit more difficult to address. Okay. Now, I said here, some of this may be statistical in nature. A lot of employers out there are not necessarily racist. They're fence-sitters. Okay? They're making decisions on things that they hear, maybe on previous work experience, but it's weak in the sense that they are making, how can I say it, decisions about candidates on the basis, they're generalizing about a group on the basis of hearsay, on the basis of experience. So this is what's called statistical discrimination. Okay? They're not necessarily against hiring immigrants, but they have some preconceptions. Now, the tragic part about this group is amenable to policy, but of course the impact is the same as if they were outright racists, actually discriminating on the basis of taste, if you want. Now, these are fence sitters. The worst thing you can have is a public discourse on migration that is negative, because then you can, I'm getting off the usual things that we talk about at the OECD, but this is an area I think that has the most nefarious consequences. Any public discourse on migration tends to push the fence sitters down to the wrong side of the fence. Okay? This is where I think we really need to be careful. That's so much for the Canadian example. It has some very precise implications for policy. Okay? Now, another point. Where should policy be putting its efforts? This is a big question. Priorities. You can have lots of different policies. And of course, everyone, I think you probably talked about this yesterday. How do you weight the index? Okay? What's important? Okay. Now, here's a point of view, which I'll be presenting you here. Actually, it's a Canadian-born economist, now in the United States. He's an immigrant. All of the research in the United States is practically done by immigrants these days on migration. There's George Borjas, who's born in Cuba, Card, born in Canada, Giovanni Perri is born in Italy. Anyway, what he says the real benchmark for integration is not the immigrants themselves, but their children. Okay? Why? Because you can always imagine reasons why immigrants themselves will have different reasons. Language proficiency, foreign education. But there's no obvious reason why the children of immigrants born and raised in a country should have results that are different from native-born persons of the same educational attainment. Okay? And this is the part that I want to talking about where you're going to be putting your efforts. I'm getting a little off track. Immigrants here, but I think this is important. Okay, so this has been treated to a certain extent yesterday, but I want to get into it because I think this is important. And one of the main determinants of labor market outcomes is education. Okay. Now this is from everybody's favorite survey, certainly in Germany, PISA. And I've basically grouped countries together here. I've put the settlement countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand together. I excluded the United States from here, but I don't want to get into the reason why. And I've grouped a lot of the old so-called migration countries together on the right-hand side and looked at the education of the mothers of immigrants, okay, of those that are in school, 15-year-olds. Okay? And you can see, of course, in Canada, highly selective migration. Immigrants are they're even better educated than the native-born population. The mothers are. Okay? The second generation, incidentally, is the children of immigrants born in the country. The first generation is the children of immigrants who were born abroad but arrived, well, before they were 15. On the right-hand side, in European countries, you've got, 25 to 30% of the children of immigrants have mothers who have, at best, primary education. Very low education, lower than compulsory education in the country, much lower. Some of them are 5 years, some of them are illiterate. Okay? Very different structure of education here. Okay? Second observation, concentration of children of immigrants in schools. Okay? Australia, Canada, New Zealand, both countries, most children of the native-born are in schools where there are not many immigrants, settlement countries, so-called, than in Europe. Okay? Very interesting sort of, don't forget now, we have very poorly educated parents in Europe, more concentration in slightly more. Let's not overdo it. So now, now the question is, what's the effect of concentration on the outcomes? Okay? Ready? There it is. Okay. This is not an easy. I'll take you through this. Okay. Now the reference group here is the students that are in schools where there's very little concentration of immigrants. Okay. Now the issue here is not really concentration of immigrants, but we'll get back to that in a minute. The reference group here. So if you want, let's look at the European results. 0 to 10% reference group. You move up to 10 to 20%, a little bit more. The results are these are point differences in PISA, incidentally. 35 points is supposedly 1 year of education equivalent. Okay? So 10 to 20% concentration, not much difference. Start getting up to 20 to 30%, the results start deteriorating. Deteriorate even more than 45, you get anything from 50 to 70%. And, of course, negative results for the native-born, children of the native-born who are in the schools where there are lots of immigrants. Okay? Not very nice, all of this. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, entirely different picture. Okay? First of all, when there's no asterisk, it basically means that there are the differences are not significant. Okay? So there's no effective concentration that you can see in Canada, Australia, New Zealand. None. Except for the natives. If you're lucky enough to be, if you're a child of a native-born Canadian, you're lucky enough to be with an immigrant, your outcomes improve. You're up to 26 points. You get a little deterioration when you get up to 45%. This is migration as we'd like to see it, let's face it. This is diversity. This is results in schools paying off. What's the difference? Quite clearly, I mean, I've phrased this in terms of concentration of immigrants because it's stark. This is study work that's in progress. We're going to be looking at this quite clearly from the point of view of concentration of disadvantage. That's the issue. The combination of disadvantage and migration status and concentration is a deadly one. Okay? That's the message, I think, coming out of this. And, I mean, I think the message has been, I've heard it, I just saw a press clipping talking about Ulrich Becker, who's made the same point, essentially, in recent weeks. Okay, so now I have more, actually, for you, as if that weren't enough. Employment outcomes of the children of immigrants and children of the native-born, taking into account their educational attainment. Okay? And again, Canada, here I brought in the United States, Switzerland actually. Very little difference between the employment rates of the children of immigrants and children of the native-born. The other European countries here, this is by educational attainment. Okay? These are people born, whether they're children of immigrants or children of the native-born, they are persons born in the country, educated completely in the country. Okay? Germany, not too bad here actually. If you're low educated in Germany, very little difference, whether you're native-born, foreign-born. It's curiously enough when you're highly educated that the differences occur. No other country really shows this type of phenomenon. Look at the Netherlands, catastrophic results for low educated. France as well. A lot of the countries, reasonably good results for the highly educated, poor results for the low and medium. Okay? This is men, incidentally, I believe, yes. Women, oh, I think I switched things around. Oh yeah, this is actually women. Okay, I'm sorry, this is not labeled properly, I think. Let me see. No, it is. This is men, this is women. This is women because, of course, the highly educated women in Germany, again, results, differences between the children of the native-born and children of the foreign-born, 20 percentage points in employment rates. Huge, absolutely huge. Okay. So here, why? Why is this? I don't have any explanation for this, quite frankly, because they are, in principle, people of the same educational attainment. Okay. There is some diagnosis work to be done here. Conclusions. Assessing and evaluating policies is useful, but let's face it, we really have to identify the nature of the problem. Putting the right policies in place depends on correctly identifying the nature of the problem. And as I've attempted to show here, the labor market outcomes of immigrants depend not just on integration policies, but depend also on migration policies, on differences in human capital, and on the extent of discrimination. Okay? You can have the same discrimination policy in countries where there's more discrimination, less discrimination. It's clearly going to be more effective in one than in the other. Now, my final comment has to do with where your priorities lie. This is, I think, we should put far more efforts on the children of immigrants. A favorable future for them is not really a certainty. Although we are seeing, and you heard recently that there are improvements, of course, in PISA for the children, for the for Germany, and this is due to the fact that improvements have occurred for the children of immigrants. But why? Because I've looked at this actually. They're far fewer. They're becoming fewer and fewer children of immigrants now. They have low-educated mothers. That's the explanation. But far more attention really needs to be devoted to this group. This is the future. The immigrants themselves can, as I say, there's always reasons. You can make adjustments for certain efficiencies if you want. The fact that employers don't recognize the foreign work experience, there are implications, but you cannot afford to make mistakes for the children. And so I think there's far more attention needs to be addressed to this group and to the reasons for the unfavorable outcomes. Thank you for your attention. I've put in here a few things that we've done in recent years that you might want to have a look at. We've done actually one for Germany, labor market integration in Germany, that deals of immigrants. I think it may get into the second generation, I don't recollect. And recently, well not recently, and shortly, there's going to be something dealing with naturalization. Okay, thank you.